Well, you want to get into it?
We're excited.
Sure, let's do it. So I kind of wanted, as I said, you've seen me on the show before, and you've seen me talk about F5 Big IP. So you must be wondering, like, well, what is Eric talking to you to me about this whole Volterra thing? And what I've been doing at F5 over the last couple of years is helping our customers deploy our Big IP platform into the public cloud environments and kind of being able to bring it together. And just kind of what I've seen is this is kind of a huge problem. There's this sprawl of networking and this requirement that you have to be not only a network expert, but now you have to become a cloud specialist. So you have to become an expert at AWS networking, an expert at Azure networking, an expert at Google networking. It just goes on, and it's just kind of this kind of pace that just cannot keep up. And what was really compelling, and kind of why I'm talking to you about Volterra, is just how they kind of remove that requirement to kind of understand that particular cloud's networking and just kind of focus on what you're trying to do, which is just deliver an application, make it available, make sure that it's secure, and not have to become this kind of specialist in all things cloud. So that's really kind of what I want to share with the audience today. And with that, what I'm going to be doing is just, it's a bit of a contrived examples, but if you're like myself, you can kind of imagine the scenario, which is you're in your on-prem data center, and maybe your data center is just a server under your desk, or maybe it's kind of a large physical data center, and you just say, hey, I want to take a part of my application and migrate it to the cloud. But wait, there's a problem with the scenario, which is you just realize that this application, it has to connect home. And now you're just thinking, oh, this is a networking nightmare. How am I going to stitch together all these networks? I mean, how many people who are watching this now are a fan of IPsec tunnels, right? You just kind of wake up and you say, hey, I'm just going to go build an IPsec tunnel, right? That's the best breakfast cereal, right? Just kind of stir that in there. No, right? So what I'm going to be showing is just kind of like how there's this magic that just says, like, hey, Volterra does the thinking for you. Volterra kind of understands what these different environments are, and it kind of brings all of this together for us. So this is kind of what you'll be seeing in a demo. I thought it would be helpful to just kind of bring this to light with just some basic slides. And what we're going to be seeing is just kind of like a use case of, we're just going to start with a client application that lives in a data center. And we're going to say there's this front end application, maybe this is your Nginx tier that's talking to kind of your Java or Python, backend or maybe like an Oracle database or something, some secret sauce that just doesn't move easily. And the goal of this is we just want to say, like, hey, let's just move this out there. And this is kind of the end state that we want to get to, where we're going to have still our kind of on-prem environment. So you're still going to see that back-end application there. But we're going to take that workload and we're going to move it out to this AWS region. But we're going to do it in a way that instead of having to do kind of the old school IPsec tunnels or just kind of other messiness, we're going to say we're going to leverage this kind of SaaS platform to kind of deploy into this environment. And before I go to this, something that I should probably help the viewers and something that's helped me is to just kind of understand that, I called it magic, but this is really just kind of basic, right? Is we're talking about something that many of our Big IP viewers know already, which is the power of a proxy. And what I'm talking about is, what I'll be talking about is something, and what we've heard from Mark is something that's called Volt Mesh. And what Volt Mesh is at the end of the day is, it is a machine. It could be running on bare metal hardware in your data center. It could be a virtual machine, or in some cases, it could even be a container, but I won't focus on that today. But the brilliance of it is, much like the Big IP can run in different platforms, Volt Mesh can also run in many platforms. And the beauty of that is that it can also run in a cloud environment. But one of the big differences, and this is what was really excited, is that you don't have to be an expert on how to deploy into AWS. So take, for example, this environment where I want to kind of connect into there. I'm just going to do a brief demo of the console right now, is that here is just kind of where we're going to start within this Volterra console. And right now, there's kind of different personas that we can kind of interact with this, because Volt console is really meant to kind of cater to different use cases. So you might have an application owner that needs to kind of control the services that they're doing. But if you're the network person, the person who's kind of responsible for spinning out the environment, you're going to be working in the system namespace. And if you're kind of more an app person, some of this might seem familiar naming conventions. We talk about namespaces. A lot of this is kind of influenced about ideas from Kubernetes. But from this perspective, what we can do is we can start to kind of build these kind of jigsaw pieces of how we're going to connect our services, how we're going to connect our applications, how we're going to solve this basic problem of how do I have my application still function after I move it into the cloud. And for, if you are responsible for kind of making this connection, you may not know all the intricate details of how do I build an AWS network, how do I connect it in. What Volterra does for you is you can just say here and say, hey, I have an AWS site where I need to connect into. And you can say, maybe I want to build a net new network within that environment. Maybe I have an existing network that I need to connect into. You just fill in this information, hit save, and it will build that virtual machine out in the cloud environment. And the net result of it is, again, this is kind of what happens, is it's going to be deploying this Volt Mesh node into that environment. So now, if you think about that diagram that I was showing earlier, this is kind of what we've done. We've got that Volt Mesh node that we've deployed in our on-prem. We've got the Volt Mesh node that we've deployed out in the cloud. And we have the building blocks of how we can try to bring together this application. So what we're going to see in this demonstration is that we're going to stitch this together, but instead of having to kind of rely on manually dealing with Ike and keys and secrets to kind of stitch together a network, we're just going to say, that once we've deployed those nodes, it's taken care of all the communication. So those nodes just need to have external connectivity. But what they're doing is, Mark talked about this global network that Volterra owns. So there are regional edges that exist geographically around the area, and each of these nodes is communicating with that. So through that global network, as we're traversing from the network, we're going to be able to leverage that. So in the first case, we can kind of expose the service publicly, and we can have this live on Volterra's network. So this is what they refer to as a regional edge. But then this regional edge can communicate securely with this Volt Mesh node that lives in the AWS environment. And that's kind of your typical proxied use case. But what's really powerful is this problem of this front-end application still needs to talk securely to the service that lives in my on-prem data center. And in this case, we can now expose a private service. We could also potentially layer on additional security, and then establish a secure communication path for the private communication. So this is just really powerful in terms of taking this kind of age-old problem of how do I get my application to work, and kind of what you'll see is do it in a very easy to do manner.
Yeah, just to interrupt you really quick, I can think of 1,000 examples back in my network engineering days where we just wanted to be able to have applications between our two data centers talk, and the crazy BGP and OSPF calisthenics and yoga we had to do that complicated our network design and outage windows and all of that, trying to figure that stuff out. Design work took longer, troubleshooting took longer, and just to be able to overlay a system like that is, makes, 15 years ago me very happy.
But you're still happy today too, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear. Just to be clear.
Because he's still eating his Fruit Loops, right?
That's right. Every now and then, yeah.
Yeah. So as what you'll see in this demo, and I promise I will complete this on schedule, is that I'm going to make use of this kind of silly demo app. And, Mark earlier talked about modern apps, but like, this demo app, I like to think that like all apps start as crappy apps, right? So maybe you have an app at home, and this is kind of my demo app where it's really meant to just kind of show you from a networking perspective what's going on. So to all the app developers out there, I apologize. This is meant for more illustrative purposes. If you are into more of like microservices and using like hipster app, we also have some very nice demos that can kind of showcase some of the more advanced capabilities. But for our audience today, I just really want to kind of hone in just so you can kind of help you understand. Because for me, this was kind of a mystery of like, you talk about this Volt mesh on these slides, but just show me how it actually works. So to help illustrate how it works, this is just going to kind of illustrate the points that we go along. So the first is that as we're connecting to this app, it'll clearly identify where is this running. Is this running in our AWS environment, or is this running out in the quote-unquote on-prem environment, which will be called UDF within this. We get some networking information. So we're going to see, what is that kind of service that's in there. And really, I just want to do this to kind of prove where it is. And more importantly, we're going to see what the source of that connection is. And really what I want to just do is just kind of demystify how this is working. And the spoiler alert is that if you've worked with Big IP, you kind of understand the powerful nature of a reverse proxy, or if you've worked with Nginx. And that's really kind of the glue that's going to do this. I could do a whole separate network where I can show you how I could do this in a routed mode, but for today, I'm kind of focusing on kind of a method that we can use with Volterra for doing this in a non-routed mode where we're securing the communication through a proxy. All right, so with that, let's dive into our demo. So I'll start with, this is kind of, you saw the Volterra console before, but what we're looking at is just a picture to just kind of illustrate these 2 points. So in this particular environment, we've got the on-prem is kind of hanging out on the East Coast, and our cloud environment is hanging out on the West Coast. And really what we're going to do is we're going to cover those slides that we had in before, is how do we stitch together these two sites, and how do we stitch it together without having to know BGP or OSPF or IPsec. We just say there's these 2 points there and we want to be able to connect it. Oh, and I should have highlighted it earlier too, is that if you think about the building blocks of an application, if you have a front-end application and you have a back-end application, how does that front-end application know how to talk to that back-end application? Most application developers probably wouldn't use an IP address that's not super friendly for an application developer. You'll probably have a DNS name, and maybe it'll be an internal name. So what I'm doing at this step is I'm creating an internal DNS name that will be advertised by the Volt Mesh node that's in my AWS environment. And why is that necessary? Because when I migrated my application from on-prem into the cloud, I don't want to have to rewrite that application. I want to be able to say, in the on-prem, it was using this internal DNS name, and all I really want to change is where it's pointing to. So that's really what that step about is, with the domain is saying that, this is where you should look to. This particular service is running on 8443. And now we get into the next super powerful part of Volterra, is that Volterra is meant for not just managing one site, but it's meant for managing potentially hundreds of sites. So in this particular example, what I'm saying is that I know that this particular service is running just in my home site. But let's say that you are dealing with a situation where you might have hundreds of stores or hundreds of branches. You can kind of create what's a virtual site, and that will kind of automatically kind of propagate this service to those sites. So it's a very powerful concept in kind of thinking about how do you start to organize your network. So if you're coming from an application developer perspective, I almost think of this like doing like a SQL query on your network, or perhaps if you worked with Kubernetes using an app selector, right? It's this idea of, how do we kind of use labels and metadata to be able to kind of construct our network instead of worrying about network ranges. But I'm also using an IP address. for this as well. I could have also used service discovery. So it's also, I could have put in a DNS name. And what's also interesting about this is because we have the Volt Mesh node in each of the sites, it could use the local DNS to kind of identify where that backend service is. Or perhaps you have something like console with service discovery, or maybe we can extract that from a Kubernetes cluster that's running in there. So it's a very dynamic way of discovering, the big IP equivalent of where are my pool members, right? That's the problem that we're trying to solve at the end of the day. We're going to throw in a health check because it's always good to know that things are healthy. And what's cool about this too is because we have each of these nodes running in each of the sites, when we're doing that health check, it's going to come from that Volt Mesh node that's adjacent to where that service is. So we are always making sure that, within that site, within that network, that the service is healthy within there. And this is going to be it. So in this case, this is a private service. We don't want this riding out there on the public internet. So again, in this particular example, I'm targeting a particular site. But this could be a way, if you want to work with your security team, you might say, this set of developers needs to access this resource in a particular set of environments. So you can kind of start to kind of construct, what does your network look like? And that creates the back-end communication. And just to kind of go back to the slides for a minute, what we just set up is kind of the first building block of this, where we need to be able to connect from this point front end right here to the back end right there. So that's kind of what we just kind of saw there. So the next part is going to be doing the public portion of this application. We want this application to be available globally. One of the super cool things, and before I get to the global part of it, is you'll see that I just checked that little box for manage DNS records. In this case, I've delegated a DNS zone, so kind of the public record for this particular domain, to Volterra. And the reason that I've done that is I don't want to have my teams to have to think about, I have to go into an IPAM system to register to DNS. So what's happening at this case is as I'm creating this resource, Volterra is going to take care of propagating this to public DNS. So in the previous example, we were talking about private DNS that's being served out by that Volterra gateway. But in this case, we're talking about global DNS. We'll go through similar steps that we went to for the TCP load balancer, where we're going to kind of set up the origin pool, make sure that it's in the correct site. The variation here is we're targeting now the on-prem or the UDF site that we have from our demonstration environment. So we're kind of showing that there's flexibility, that essentially wherever that Volterra Volt Mesh node is running, we can both advertise and also it can either be like the destination, like the pools of what you're trying to pull from, or it could also be the VIP, right? So it's a very flexible way of, do you want to advertise a service there, or do you want to use a service from there? And it's all proxy based in this particular example that I'm doing. So I don't know, Jason or John, if you have any questions as I'm going along, or if anything out from the chat.
We did have one question or just a comment from Marcus on, sounds and feels a lot like Cloudflare and Magic Transit.
Well, there's differences in just that from this perspective, we're also not just covering kind of the public portion of it, but also the ability to kind of create these private endpoints as well. Right. So like this particular side is probably very comparable to kind of your kind of run-of-the-mill CDN, but the former portion of it, and what's really powerful, is that it's not just about kind of covering that kind of edge part of the public facing side, but it's also able to deal with that messiness of, you talked about that earlier. There's that back-end application. Right. That's probably not suitable to kind of just stand up on the internet. This gives you a secure way to kind of expose it through this. So this is now just kind of we're connecting in, and I just want to kind of highlight on this kind of what the building blocks are that we have, which is that we've successfully connected to AWS, and we've done this through Volterra's regional edge. So there was an Anycast address that was resolved it was able to connect through, and we brought it in. And then you can also see that the connection was coming from within that AWS environment. So we didn't have to kind of like actually expose a public IP address within AWS. All the communication is initiated going out from AWS. It's not like the service was coming in there. And this kind of highlights the way the traffic was coming in is that as we're coming in off of that Anycast network, we're going to move through kind of Volterra's global network and then reach the service that's within there. And then what was previously flashed by earlier was just kind of showing how when we were connecting through to the backend application, again, this private communication, this is the one that you don't want exposed on the internet. Again, we're making use of that proxy so that we can kind of securely communicate from AWS to the on-prem without having to kind of publicly expose that kind of back-end service. I'll just kind of let this run through because I know we're also kind of coming up on the top, and it's just going to kind of run through other aspects of it. But hopefully this is kind of the learning process that I went through to kind of understand Volterra, that this is kind of helping other people kind of imagine how Volterra could kind of help them with their own problems. There's a lot of information that Volterra kind of gains from being having those nodes in there, and you can kind of see here that we can kind of centrally aggregate all of that information and present it to this. So whether it's the application team, the security team, or the networking team, they're all going to be able to kind of share this information through this kind of centralized console. Get stats, look for problems. It doesn't become this like chase of, where's the problem, looking in logs in different systems. We've kind of brought all of that information into this kind of single view so that, whether it's a network problem or an application problem, you can kind of, quickly resolve where the issue is and get a fix in short order.
So just a quick question from me.
Yep.
In your demo, you go through and you build it manually, but I noticed there were tabs on there where you could look at the JSON, and I'm assuming that you can then take that and you can automate that whole thing rather than going through the steps manually in the Volt console.
Yes. So again, for me, it's always useful to just kind of start with a UI just so you can kind of understand where the pieces are. But, to your point, I also come from an application programmer background. So Volterra does have a very well documented API. So every single action that I was doing through the UI could be done through the API. And if you want to kind of leverage more of an infrastructure tool, they also have a Terraform provider so that, if you do find that there's a lot of repetitive tasks, or if you're trying to incorporate it into the lifecycle of your application deployment, and then they also have a Terraform provider that can be leveraged for that. So, Jason and John, hopefully I've kind of demystified a little bit, kind of what is this kind of Volterra thing, and kind of seen just kind of, one baby example of how it can be used to kind of deal with kind of just some of the pain points that we have of, how do we get this application securely exposed? How do we secure the communication internally? There's just a lot of possibilities of how you can use Volterra, within your environment.
Yeah, I think that was perfect because, it's like today's show is Meet Volterra, right? It's like, your first day of class, you're meeting your teacher and you're kind of getting a feel for what's this going to be about. And, as we dig into more use cases and integrations with F5 products and Nginx and Shape and how all that is going to play out over time, we'll definitely have more integration stories and solutions to share down the road. And so, yeah. I think it was great.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you start here, you start kind of exactly what you said. You kind of baby step into this, and this was a beautiful introduction. So I think that, the mysticism around it has been lifted a bit,
I mean, Daniel's called it, right? Very enlightening. Awesome. So,
what else can you say? I mean, really.
Now seeing the man behind the curtain, right? You're just like, oh, okay.
Yeah. But that's awesome. It's enlightening to do that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool, man. It's always a pleasure, man. You do a great job, and we really appreciate it, Eric.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me on.
All right.
Awesome, man.
Thanks, Eric.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
All right, man.